Assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in another of these individual sessions. We have been able to make significant progress in the context of our video on India, all the books that concern themselves with India and all the books that we were able to identify in our research concerning India. And here when I say India, I mean pre-independence India, pre-British era India. I'm talking of India as the subcontinent in this context, and not to wind up stepping on people's toes that yes, Bangladesh exists, Afghanistan exists, Bhutan exists, Pakistan exists, Nepal exists. It's the subcontinent is a very vast and complex and intricate political and socio-economic and even socio-geographic hub, and it has been a cradle of civilization in a lot of aspects. So just putting that out, this isn't just me enforcing a sort of supremacy in a political context. We will definitely be taking that into account when we talk about the subcontinent, all works over there, fiction, non-fiction, and so on. And that will be uploaded. Having said that, this isn't going to be that. This is just an individual review. And this is about the Arabian Nights and the Tales from 1001 Nights, as translated by Sir Richard Burton. Definitely an interesting person, Sir Richard Burton. There's actually a work regarding his life, Sir Richard Burton himself. He was very notable in the sense that he actually was one of the earliest known non-Muslims to have visited Makkah and Medina at a time when non-Muslims were not allowed entry over there. In fact, on pain of death, you as a non-Muslim could not enter the holy cities of Makkah and Medina, and he went there. So he went there in disguise for sure, but he went there all the same. And he talked about a lot of things in his life. Like his experiences of India, his experiences of the Crimean War, Zanzibar, Africa, his experiences again of the works that he wrote on the works that he wrote about Arab society. The fact that it's actually important to emphasize, our very first translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam came from Burton. Like, he was a very significant person in that regard in his translation works. Definitely a linguist of the highest caliber, although very controversial in his approach. He was notably controversial at the time when he was alive. He had his scandals associated with him, and this work it's a fascinating read because it carries with it all that Victorian era bias that we have come to associate with Orientalism. One of the works which must be emphasized over here and which we would strongly advise that you should read is Edward Said's Orientalism. And it talks about how Orientalism as a phenomenon, think of Orientalism as manifest destiny. It's actually similar to that because it emphasized these stereotypes that anything which was not associated with the West was exotic, and it carried cultures of very, very flamboyant debauchery and lust. And this is one of those works which was influenced by that entire mindset. And definitely, even then, consider the volume. These are very much his translations of as many of the stories as he possibly could manage, even ending with Shehrzade coming back alive. You have to keep in mind, the 1001 Arabian Nights is not something small scale. Edgar Allan Poe translated those works and added his own spin to it, the grimy bastard that he was. Grim bastard that he was. And considering also that A.S. Bayat was the editor when this work was actually published. She's a writer herself. A.S. Bayat actually wrote plenty of fiction novels of her own. So considering she gives it an introduction and talks about how 1001 Arabian Nights were important in the context of understanding how you know um, uh, Arab society had developed its phrases, its mythos, its idioms. Like Romance of the Three Kingdoms is Chinese, and it has many of the phrases which the Chinese themselves use to emphasize themselves, their internal selves, their how you would call it, their zeitgeist, their Sehnsucht, their realpolitik, if you will, and all of it is emphasized. This is one of those works which gives you a cyclical understanding of how society, at least in terms of literature, how it viewed itself. So the fact that it's translated into English and it has that Orientalism bias in it, it isn't any wonder that most of the English who went around to the world, who conquered and who went about with their entire approach of bringing the English to the non-English worlds, it carries that aspect with it. Like Sir Henry Haggard, for example, and Dr. Livingstone, made famous by the phrase Dr. Livingstone, I presume. And also we have later onwards the postmodern self-criticism that was carried out by the British Empire through Conrad when he wrote Heart of Darkness, and with Ian Forster when he wrote his book, that very famous book which he wrote about India. I can't seem to remember it. When I'll remember it, it'll be here in this particular portion. Ian Forster's book was definitely one of those books which also talked about it as well. Not to mention we have even after the empire died, it also is reflected in a nostalgic aspect through Frederick Forsyth in his work The Afghan and The Kill List, which used the 21st century, the beginning of the 21st century, as a basis to describe how the terrorists were caught, and the entire aspects regarding spies and such. This is actually something which emphasizes some of the aspects even of Thomas Lawrence, when he wrote his work on Seven Pillars of Wisdom, when he wrote that. So definitely something to take into account, but very, very scandalous. This is not for children. If you are giving it to your kid, that kid is going to be traumatized immediately. But if you are an adult, this is erotica. It even carries with it some very fabulous and very fascinating aspects about how Arab society viewed its humor, it viewed its anger, it viewed its tendency to be very prolonged, and the emphasis of circumlocution rather than on laconic conversations that often tend to leave the Germans and others and most Europeans irascible, because it's a very Arabian aspect. And just to emphasize the whole thing. So let's see. Like for instance, we have Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. That is the most famous work in this. Like if we take, basically it starts off with King Shehryar and his brother, right? The tale of the bull and the ass. How the emphasis of bigotry, basically, of even alluding to how exhorters tended to emphasize the Pharaoh's fear of the Jews rising up, right? So the Israelites. They were not called Jews then, they were the Israelites. And how that is carried forward over here. It's very interesting, and it talks about how Nur al-Din just and even some of the stories from the Quran which were reflected in these works, because most of these they didn't take place in a small specific era. They span an ethos, basically. Like, you have the Persian influences when Persian became Farsi, Arabicized Farsi, so it carries that influence in it as well. When the Muslim influence spread in modern day Persia, modern day Iran as we know it, and definitely one of those interesting aspects over here. And just to give it an example, for instance, if we take just one story, it had reached me, O auspicious king, that there was a fisherman well stricken in years, who had a wife and 3 children, and withal was of poor condition. Now it was his custom to cast his net every day 4 times and no more. On a day he went forth about noontide to the seashore, where he laid down his basket, and tucking up his shirt and plunging into the water, made a cast with his net, and waited till it settled to the bottom. Then he gathered the cords together and hauled away at it, but found it weighty. And however much he drew it landwards, he could not pull it up. So he carried the ends ashore and drove a stake into the ground and made the net fast to it. Very much like how this actually would definitely emphasize the tendency within Arabic itself to reiterate certain phrases just to keep attention of the audience, which is carried forward as well in the context of how Greece, through the Iliad and the Iliad especially, how they would use that as a principle when they go about their whole narration of that era. So it's definitely a work of fiction for sure, but it's one of those fictional works that carries with it a lot of weight, and it's highly recommended that if you can get a copy of this, it's available online, it's public domain. And just as your support through liking and subscribing this channel, through liking and subscribing other channels that talk about public domain works, you can download this online. Archive.org has it, Project Gutenberg has it. It's available on Google Books as well. I believe it's available on Google Books. So definitely support the open libraries causes such that they are able to grow and prosper and become a part of our identity and a part of how we are able to grow as people. If we aren't able to do it, then we allow liars and rumor mongers and other sort of bilious elements in society to rise and cause chaos and disorder and unjustified slaughter to be endorsed and appreciated, because the government is only going to follow the voice of those elements in society which firmly believe that their voice is the loudest and therefore should be given the most claim, should be given the most emphasis. And that's why I feel that these works are important. You must give them weight, or else if we do not give them weight, we run the risk of losing ourselves. Even if this work ceases to be translated, which I doubt, let's assume in a world that it does stop being translated, the Arab identity will be lost, because a lot of the phrases that were used in the 1001 Arabian Nights, the Farsi that we know as high classical Farsi in the Arabicized age of Farsi, of a post-Islamic, post-Quranic Arabic and pre-Quranic Arabic, especially post-Quranic Arabic, this is a work that was narrated and emphasized and grew and became an identity of its own. And I'm not saying that it should be discarded completely. It is an identity after all. It's a work of fiction that, like all fictions, carries a weight with it. So if we do not support our causes like that, we run the risk of letting society become amorphous and hence dissolving into just pure small, very insular identities. And in that context, I hope that this video proved useful for you and that you are able to support open access libraries and aspects pertaining to that. Thank you, and we look forward to your comments and feedback on this video.